Check, check. All right, cool. This is working. Awesome. So thank you so much for coming post-lunch break. My name is Kelsie Nabben. I'm a researcher at RMIT University in Australia. I also do work leading the governance research team at Block Science, a complex systems R&D firm that's distributed but kind of based in the US. And today I want to talk about DAO vulnerabilities. So this is a mapping methodology that's come out of my PhD research, but is being practically applied in the space by myself and some of the teams I work with, as well as others. So I'll try and break it down. I'll see how I go for time, but if you have a question, I'm definitely available afterwards to have any conversations. So the topic of my research is on resilience in decentralized systems, and I'm a social scientist, so I'm really interested in the social outcomes of these technologies. So not just the technical dynamics of cybersecurity, but what happens when people use these tools, and do they help us to adapt and transform in response to crisis or changes in environment? So that's kind of my working definition, and that's taken out of the literature in resilience in socio-technical systems. And so this is just one figure that's off a blog post, so you can find some of the things that I'm speaking about today in more detail. But really what I had to do to be able to begin to analyse resilience in decentralised infrastructures was to come up with models for assessment and analysis. And so this is one of those where I'm starting to break down a DAO. What is its purpose or objective? What is the animating purpose that this organisation exists for? Who are the stakeholders involved? What are their threats? So as an ethnographer, I'm interested in the perspectives of the community themselves rather than overlaying my own perspective necessarily. So what are the threats that the different stakeholders perceive? And then what are the vulnerabilities of each stakeholder? And that comes from work out of science and technology studies, where the point of identifying vulnerabilities is to thus address those as an opportunity to enhance resilience. So that's what I'm trying to do when evaluating DAOs, and maybe a way that you can think about how this might apply to your own project as well. We then move from the analysis to the action space. So at multiple scales of a decentralized organization, how do you start to think about the responses to the threats that have been identified, or the vulnerabilities? And that can be looked at from two perspectives. So if you're thinking about assessing vulnerabilities in your own DAO or a DAO that you participate in, you might want to think about ways to address those. As a researcher with my kind of ethnographic hat on, I'm thinking about what is the community doing to adapt. So what are the novel or interesting ways that DAOs are actually responding to their own changing environments? And I've found various different interesting things from, the way that DAOs organize, so using subsidiarity or kind of multiple working groups, or this breakdown into kind of sub-DAOs and core working groups or stewards or whatever they're called across different projects, to many other things around, the governance of algorithmic pipelines. So how do you actually govern algorithms in a sustainable way to use those as tools to help you address or flag threats? And then the feedback loops. So how do you kind of communicate these findings, either more broadly as a researcher or within your own organisation, to create kind of closed loops around this analysis and assessment? So here's another map, just another way of looking at some of the same methodology, but out of a different blog post on my Substack. And this looks at the multiple systems that I've mentioned. So there's a really great paper called Introduction to Crypto Economics that talks about these systems as multi-scale. So the micro level, the meso, the organizational, and then the macro, so the whole of DAO ecosystem. I also have broken it down here into endogenous threats. So what emerges from within the DAO itself that might be a vulnerability, and exogenous. So what's coming from outside that could be perceived as a threat and potentially turned into an opportunity. And so I wanted to emphasize also what this methodology is not. I've seen the language pop up, which is amazing if people want to use this idea or adapt it or apply it or whatever. But what it's not critical study of DAOs. It's not saying, DAOs are bad because they're too technically focused or they're plutocratic or whatever. It's actually about an analysis, an organizational analysis. So what is going on? What are the dynamics that are happening within this organization or this system? It's not fully comprehensive. So in the next slide, I'll talk about some of the different buckets where we can identify vulnerabilities. It's not a fully comprehensive technical or legal or other analysis, but it's one tool in a toolkit. It's also not an endpoint. So an area of research I'm really interested in at the moment is how do you better begin to assess your action space? So if you want to develop interventions or policy responses to vulnerabilities that you've identified in a distributed way amongst your community, how do you actually begin to do that? So in practice, and the reference here is actually to a blog post with a very detailed analysis, which was done quite rapidly, of Lido. So in response to the DAO vulnerabilities post, the CTO actually reached out and said, this would be really helpful. It's great for the community, for them to see that we're kind of critically assessing our own DAO and governance design across different spectrums. And so these are some of the things that we learned from that analysis. And this one was done in conjunction with the research team at Block Science. So social vulnerabilities that emerged from a methodology which included conversations with people, digital ethnography, which is like observation and analysis of online channels, so social media channels, internal communication channels, documentation from the forums and so on. So we found that some critical functions were person dependent instead of function dependent. So when you have a crisis, such as a massive shift in token price, which changes the balance in all the liquidity pools, it can't be reliant on the right person knowing the right thing to do, which is like messaging someone else on Telegram to tell them whether to communicate that publicly to the DAO or not. That has to be process-oriented and a function, and if the right head of something is on leave, there's an organisational bucket for that to be filled anyway. Technical, shout out to my colleague Barada, who did a lot of this analysis looking at governance voting interfaces. So finding some really, really interesting things about how you could potentially co-opt a web address and actually compromise the voting interfaces that the DAO was using. Economics, so we were talking about liquid staking for this specific analysis, and so the ways in which liquid staking could become kind of like a curve wars or this like winner takes all market that ratchets up, and actually that has sort of semi-unfolded in the community since this analysis was done by an analysis by someone called Sasha, who was also engaged by the DAO to look at some of the kind of effects of Lido on the broader Ethereum ecosystem and whether the DAO should limit themselves or not. And they recently voted not to, which is quite interesting, thinking about incentives and incentive alignments in the consensus of Ethereum. And then legal. So legal emerged, which I ended up adding back to the original methodology around some DAOs not being registered entities. So obviously it's a massive risk in terms of liability to the founders and participants in any DAO. They chose not to register, but then there's uncertainty around the future of the kind of organizational structure, who owns specific IP. So Lido has a first mover advantage on the liquid staking market, but could someone copycat them? Could someone who owns the registered domains, are they registered to individuals, which creates kind of a lack of redundancy, and so on. So that's a bit of an example of this methodology in practice. And so really, my findings here are kind of threefold that I've pointed out. So one, vulnerability identification across the kind of socio-technical, economic, legal, and let me know if you come up with other dynamics as an analysis tool, both to analyze DAOs kind of externally looking in and create kind of a communication feedback loop, as well as for DAOs themselves to start to think more reflectively about their own kind of governance practices and organizational structures and how they might actually build in greater adaptivity in line with their purpose to become more resilient organizations. The identification of these, and then, as I mentioned before, like how you might actually begin to assess the relevant interventions to these vulnerabilities and rank them in terms of priority of importance as well. And then more broadly, this kind of assessment of some of the organizational and governance dynamics is starting to foreground the social dynamics of DAOs. And so looking at the institutional infrastructure that coincides with these technical infrastructures. And so that's one of the broader kind of findings out of my research across case studies in quite different areas when evaluating resilience, is really around what are the kind of institutional infrastructure, so the ways of organising and the processes that need to work alongside, you know, great technology to actually make it viable in practice. And so I have many writings on that if you're interested in IPFS, in open hardware and metaverse things. There's some other kind of major case study areas for me alongside DAOs. So thank you. I have 3 minutes left if anyone would like to ask a question. Otherwise, I'll move to the side for the next speaker and be available after this.
Yeah, I didn't think I'd have a question, but I actually do. Yeah, so with like governance as we have it now, like regular voting, it's obviously, you know, there's less engagement and it's harder to do. DAOs, I think, are great in that they bring that closer. It can be more frequent. People can vote more often and have that. But we still have governance tokens separate from the product tokens. Do you think we'll ever progress to a point where governance becomes an intrinsic part of some product in a sense, where it becomes part of the mechanisms in a more connected way? Or I'm just sort of just wondering if that's ever a thing that could come to be.
I'm curious how you would conceive of or articulate your understanding of governance. In some of the research and the writing I've done, part of that was with Zargam from Block Science, credit where credit's due. We talk about governance as the kind of ability to steer the system. So anything that is part of steering that system towards its sort of shared purpose. And so I think it's really important just to point out that it's broader than the token distribution or voting with a token. And it's kind of, you know, governance can be enacted in a bunch of different ways in terms of setting, you know, the boundaries of how you influence and steer an entire system. So is that implicit in the technical infrastructure?
Yeah, I guess as an example, let's say there's some threshold for some activity and governance to say that that threshold will be changed. Would it ever be the case that the use of the system, and if people are leaning a certain way with the number, that you would then shift that threshold incrementally anyway based on the use? And so the action of using the product becomes the votes, if you will, like an adaptive system.
Yeah, there's really interesting dynamic mechanisms around that. I'm actually writing a paper at the moment on signalling systems, which is going to look at conviction voting, which was something developed out of block science. The way that One Hive integrates that is dynamic to pass proposals. So based on the conviction by the community, they're staking, and depending on how much money is in the treasury, that's easier or harder to pass alongside the conviction against it. I've written about this in 2 papers, and then I'm doing the signalling one, so happy to discuss that more. But yes, and I hope things move more in that direction.